The second and last video on epidemiology is going to focus on looking at graphs to determine the pattern of outbreaks that are going on in a community. So two key descriptions are going to be endemic versus epidemic. So how I think of them is the endemic is never ending. And so what that means is that there's this steady occurrence in a particular area and population. So the amount of a particular disease that is typically, just like I said, always present within a community is referred to as the endemic level of the disease. So think of the endemic level as the baseline. Okay, now please note that the endemic level is not necessarily the desired level, okay, because oftentimes we prefer to have 0 cases of a disease. But the endemic level is that baseline that is typically observed, okay? So some diseases are so rare, right, that a single case will warrant an epidemiologic event, okay? And so as you can see on this graph, the epidemic is where there's an excess of normal number of cases, okay? And so that spike, we also call that an outbreak, okay? So like I just mentioned, let's go to the next slide. I tend to just start talking, there we go. So like I just mentioned, some diseases are so rare that a single case is going to be, worth investigating. And this is what happened with the Listeria outbreak that happened a few years back, right? There are very few instances where we hear about listeriosis outbreaks, and this just so happened to be one of them. And I think there were like 3 cases in Texas and just a few kind of sporadically over the country. And they ended up shutting down Bluebell so they could completely, sterilize it and everything. And then luckily, Bluebell is back in business. All right. So when we're looking at a graph here, okay, so this is an example of an epidemic. So you can see that the normal baseline in terms of number of cases, right? If you're looking on the y-axis, it's around 3 to 5-ish, maybe around 6. Can you see my mouse? No, you can't. You can kind of tell where most levels typically occur, but then there was an outbreak around, February and in April. So you can see these spikes are going to be examples of an epidemic. So here is a graph about typhoid fever. And here's on the y-axis our number of reported cases by year ranging from 1977 to 2007. So knowing that typhoid fever is an acute disease, oh, where's it going? There we go. What do you think we are going to be worried about reporting? Incidence or prevalence? Well, remember from the last video, if it's an acute disease, right, then we are going to report incidence because typically incidence and prevalence are the same because people aren't living with the disease for a very long period of time. Okay, so that's what the information that we're worried about here. And so does the circled part of the graph represent an epidemic, an endemic, or, excuse me, sporadic levels? So you might be saying to yourself, Chelsea, what is sporadic levels? Well, sporadic refers to a disease that occurs irregularly and infrequently. So maybe you typically don't see it and then bloop, but there it is randomly. Oh, bloop, there it is 5 years later. Oh, bloop, 20 years later. Okay, very infrequently. Okay, and so as you're going to see in other graphs, sometimes an epidemic will occur in relative frequency. Okay, so checking this out, we don't really have any spikes right? So it's not going to be an epidemic or sporadic. This is really just kind of that baseline level. So this would be an endemic. All right, looking at some confirmed botulism cases. Botulism is an acute disease. So again, we are concerned with incidence. That's what we're measuring here. What is the endemic level? Okay, so look around here, it's around 20-ish, 21, right? That's kind of where it's just baseline and there aren't these peaks, okay? In what years did epidemics occur? That's where the peaks are going to be, okay? All right, so leprosy, so incidence versus prevalence. So leprosy is a chronic disease. So in this case, we are concerned with both incidence and prevalence, which is why you see both of them on this graph, okay? And so you can see that the incidence level has remained relatively steady, but the prevalence, which again is the total number of cases, is drastically decreasing. So why might that be? Well, it's going to be because we have developed some effective treatments for this disease. And so we find that the total number of cases is on the decline. All right, so anthrax, morbidity. So we need to talk about what morbidity is even referring to. And so two additional terms that are important in the realm of epidemiology is going to be morbidity and mortality. And so when you hear the word morbidity and mortality, you probably are more familiar with mortality. That is going to be the frequency that a disease results in death. Morbidity just refers to an illness or a disease. Okay, so basically any condition that isn't considered quote unquote healthy. Okay, and so typically we use morbidity when we're talking about chronic, again, those long-term diseases. And so we can actually describe, a person or a population with respect to morbidity. So, someone that has a high morbidity is considered to be less healthy maybe than somebody else. So there is a chance that they may not live as long as someone else, but morbidity doesn't mean that you're in danger of dying in the near future. Okay, so if somebody has multiple illnesses, then they would have a high morbidity compared to somebody who does not. Okay, so how would you describe this type of disease? So we're looking at anthrax here. So notice they happen pretty irregularly and not very frequently, right? Notice most times, especially since 1977, the cases have been 0, right? And then there's just kind of sporadically only 1. So you would describe this type of disease as sporadic. And then as you can see, back in 2002, we had those envelope scares where somebody was mailing out anthrax. That was pretty scary. Okay, so we are looking at tetanus on this particular graph, okay? And tetanus is an acute disease, so we're concerned with incidence, okay? And what you can see here are the number of cases between 1947 and 2007, and you can also see the number of deaths. Okay, so has there been an increase or decrease in morbidity or mortality over time? And for both, there has been a decrease, and that is because, take a second to think about it, we developed a vaccine, right? And so that could cause the decrease in mortality and morbidity because with this vaccine, people aren't getting the disease, and therefore people are not dying. Okay. The purpose of this graph is to show you why we need epidemiologists to look at the big picture. Yes, we as Americans are normally most concerned with what's happening in America, sometimes even just our own specific state. But it is important to look at what's happening worldwide, because if you look at this picture at the countries or areas at risk for rabies, if we were just looking at Texas, we'd think, hey, no big deal, right? Very low risk. Well, let's zoom out and look at the United States. Hey, still very low risk. Let's zoom out to look at the United States and Canada. Hey, still no risk. We would probably start to think rabies isn't a big deal anywhere, right? Because we're just not seeing anything. But once you start to include Mexico, we're getting down into Central and South America. Now we're seeing that that's not the case. We have some very high risk areas. And then again, zoom out even more, look at what's happening worldwide, and you see that a big chunk of the world is very, very concerned about rabies because they have very high risk of infection, which can lead to death. Okay, so if we only looked at the United States, we would miss the fact that rabies is an epidemic in other parts of the world. So now let's talk about COVID. And so COVID has been hitting the entire world, right? It's taken over our everyday lives here in America and across the globe. And so we refer to this as a pandemic. Okay, so we use the term pandemic when a disease is prevalent over the whole world. Okay, so COVID-19 is in fact a global pandemic. Okay, and you can see as of May 9th of this year, 2021, you can see what the number of confirmed deaths are in different parts of the world. All right, so when we're looking back to that term morbidity, okay, sometimes it's useful to look at the morbidity of the reservoirs, because think back to our mechanisms of pathogenesis and those 7 steps that the pathogen must take to be successful in causing a diseased state in the host. Step 1 was to have a reservoir. And so by looking at the reservoir and what's going on there, we can use that as kind of an indicator to the risk level for humans. And so rabies is an acute disease. Okay, so our morbidity is going to refer to incidence. And if you look at this graph, which animal is rabies more prevalent in? That is going to be cats. And why do you think that is? Well, cats, right, you tend to see a lot more stray cats than you do with stray dogs. And so cats are often out running around, encountering other animals that might have rabies or be a reservoir for rabies. And so cats just tend to be more at risk and more likely to have rabies than dogs. All right, so what is the efficacy of a vaccine and what is the impact of disease incidence? So remember, incidence is the number of new cases. So the MMR vaccine is for measles, mumps, and rubella. So notice that a single dose is 93% effective against measles, 78% against mumps, and 97% against rubella, which is fabulous. If you have 2 doses, notice that those numbers increase. So let's take a look at the impacts of having a vaccine. This was going to be over polio. And so in 1988, look at all these countries that had never eliminated polio. So pink is going to be countries that still had cases of polio. Then the vaccine came around, and now look, as of 2012, we're down to, what is that, only a couple, 1, 2, 3, 4 countries that have still not eliminated polio. Okay, but that is a huge change. Okay, vaccines can definitely change lives. They are game changers. All right, Here's just another graph for you of the Varivax vaccine, which is against varicella zoster virus, which causes chickenpox and later can actually reactivate and cause shingles, but more on that later. So this particular vaccine is trying to prevent chickenpox. And so you can see when the vaccine was licensed, okay, but then it had to be administered. And as you can see, looking big picture here, once people started getting vaccinated, the number of cases drastically decreased. Because notice that this number here is in the thousands. Okay, so back in 1994, we had over 90,000 cases. Down here in 2010, we're looking at, what is that, about 10,000 cases, right? So big difference. So last but not least, looking at disease patterns, we have to consider what we call the iceberg effect, okay? And so this, what it's really getting at is looking at diseases that are notifiable versus those that are not. So with a notifiable disease, anytime, you know, a case is found or there is a case of a disease, it gets reported so that we can have, you know, local and national global statistics on the frequency of these diseases. But not all diseases are notifiable or reported. So when there are instances where a large percentage of an issue is not notifiable or not notified, making it hidden from view, then we refer to that as the iceberg effect. So you might be asking, well, why would a disease in these instances not be known about? Well, sometimes the diseases just aren't on the notifiable list. We have some, quite a list out there of notifiable diseases that we're tracking. Sometimes diseases are misdiagnosed. Sometimes people just don't even go into the hospital to get diagnosed. Maybe they have a long incubation period. Sometimes people don't even know they have the disease, right? That's what's going on with a lot of the STIs, is if there's no signs or symptoms, people don't even know that they have the disease. And so there's all these unreported cases that we just don't know about. Okay, so again, if you look at this picture, you can see that we only know a little bit. What we know about the number of cases is just a tip of the iceberg, when in reality, there's a lot more cases out there. All right, y'all. That is going to be the end of our epidemiology chat. Let me know if you have any questions.